The galaxy had long known peace, or so it had seemed for the vast majority of its inhabitants. The galactic overlords ruled with an iron fist their ships and weapons, unmatched by any species across the stars they conquered and enslaved without remorse, leaving behind a trail of civilizations broken and crushed. They were known as the supreme rulers, the ones who controlled everything. But everything changed when the human dreadnought, the USS Excalibur, appeared on the outer rim of their territory. The arrival of the massive warship was unannounced and unexpected for the overlords. Their sensors were trained on 1,000 other fronts in their empire, but none of them ever warned of the approaching human force. The Excalibur was silent at first, just drifting into their space, its hull gleaming under the light of distant stars, an anomaly the overlords had never seen before. It looked insignificant, a single ship in a galaxy full of vast fleets. And yet the overlords took no chances. A scout fleet was quickly dispatched to investigate this intrusion. They were confident they would crush whatever this was without effort, but they could not have been more wrong. On the bridge of the Excalibur, Commander Sarah Klein stood staring at the screen. The Overlord fleet was approaching. She didn't speak a word to her crew, her expression cold and focused, but there was a sense of excitement in the air. She knew the odds, and yet she also knew the secret weapon. They had their greatest advantage over the Overlords was their unpredictability, their ability to think outside the box in a way that no one else could. No matter how advanced their enemies were, humanity had always found a way to adapt and survive, and now the galaxy would see that firsthand. As the Overlord ships closed in, Captain Klein issued a single command: prepare to engage. The crew sprung into action, quickly and efficiently running through the ship's various systems, checking the weapons and shields, making sure everything was in place. The Excalibur had been built for this moment, to fight against the strongest forces in the galaxy, but more than that, it had been designed to outsmart them. The ship wasn't just about power, it was about tactics and precision, and the humans had mastered both. When the Overlord fleet came into range, they fired without hesitation. They believed the Excalibur to be nothing more than a speck of dust, to be swept aside in an instant. But their first volley of fire was met with something they had never anticipated. The human dreadnought moved with the grace of a much smaller vessel. As the shots from the Overlord ships missed completely, the Excalibur swerved and struck back with precision, its weapons lighting up the void with explosive force. One Overlord ship was reduced to debris, another was crippled in an instant. The Overlords were caught off guard. They had not anticipated a single ship being able to withstand their firepower, much less retaliate so effectively. Inside the Excalibur, Klein's voice rang out, calm and measured: deliver the next strike. Keep the pressure on them, and make sure they don't have time to regroup. As the crew followed her orders, their enemy's fleet was disintegrating before their eyes. The Overlords were still trying to adjust to the unexpected onslaught, but the humans were relentless, adapting their strategy with each passing moment. It was clear to everyone on the bridge that this was no ordinary battle. The Excalibur was more than just a ship. It was a declaration that humanity was not to be underestimated. As the Overlords tried to regroup and counterattack, they began to realize something terrifying. The humans were unlike anything they had ever encountered. They were unpredictable, brilliant, and willing to sacrifice everything to ensure their victory. And this was only the beginning. Back in the heart of the Overlord Empire, Empress Erixvor sat in her command chamber, her eyes fixed on the vast galaxy map. Before her, her empire stretched across countless worlds and systems. Yet here, at the edge of her domain, an unknown variable had appeared, one that threatened to shatter everything. The first reports had come in fast and chaotic. A human ship, unlike any they had encountered, had destroyed an entire Overlord fleet and was now advancing deeper into their territory. The initial shock had given way to anger as the Empress summoned her generals and advisors. "What is this human ship?" she demanded, her voice calm but icy. "What makes it capable of such destruction?" General Norak, the chief strategist of the Overlord's military, stood tall before her, eyes narrowed in calculation. "It's unlike anything we've seen before, Empress. It's clearly an advanced warship, but it's small. Its firepower is concentrated in a way we haven't anticipated. It uses unconventional tactics. We've lost 3 fleets already trying to confront it." His voice betrayed a rare hint of frustration. The Empress's face remained unreadable as she processed the information. There was something about this that didn't sit right with her. This human ship is causing too much disruption. She said after a long silence, "Send more ships, gather every fleet in this sector. We will show them the might of the Overlords. They will regret ever entering our space." The command was clear. The Overlords would not let a single human ship make a mockery of their superiority. Their pride had been wounded, and it was not something they would tolerate. Meanwhile, on the Excalibur, Commander Klein had just received the latest intelligence reports. The Overlords were assembling a massive fleet. They were coming for them, and they were coming with everything they had. Klein stood on the bridge, her fingers tapping lightly on the console as her crew worked quickly to prepare for the incoming assault. "They're bringing everything they've got," Klein muttered to herself with a grin. "Good will give them a fight they'll never forget." She turned to her crew. "All hands, ready yourselves. We're going to take this battle to them." The Excalibur was not just a warship. It was a symbol, a statement to the galaxy that humanity would never bow to anyone, not even the so-called supreme rulers of the stars. But Klein knew this would be their toughest challenge. Yet the Overlords didn't just rely on sheer power. They had experience, they had armies and fleets built over centuries. They were not easily defeated. As the Excalibur continued its slow advance through the Overlord territory, they began to feel the weight of the coming conflict. Klein and her crew would need every ounce of their ingenuity to survive the next encounter. They couldn't afford any miscalculations. But the humans were nothing if not resourceful. Each day, the crew of the Excalibur grew more confident in their abilities. Their coordination improving, their ship systems adjusted to combat the Overlord's advanced tactics. Each member of the crew knew their role and executed it flawlessly. It wasn't just their weapons that made them dangerous, it was their adaptability, their resilience, their ability to turn the tables in the face of impossible odds. As the Overlord fleet approached, the Excalibur fired its first salvo. It wasn't just a test, it was a message. The humans were here, and they were ready to fight. Klein knew the battle ahead would be brutal, but she also knew one thing for certain: humanity would not go down without a fight, and the Overlords would soon learn that underestimating humans was a fatal mistake. The war had only just begun, but the galaxy was already beginning to shift. Humanity had proven itself a force to be reckoned with, and the Overlord's rule would never be the same again. The first true clash between humanity and the Overlords was nothing like what either side had expected. The Overlord fleet arrived in full force, a dozen ships the size of small moons, each one brimming with firepower. But the Excalibur was ready, its crew poised and ready for the battle they had been training for from the moment they left Earth's atmosphere. Commander Klein stood at the front of the bridge, watching the massive fleet close in on them. She didn't flinch, not for a second. "Ready all weapons," Klein ordered, her voice calm but filled with an electric intensity. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers on my mark." The Excalibur's systems hummed to life as the crew began their work, the ship's weapons locked into place and shields reinforced. But Klein's mind wasn't on the weapons or the ship, it was on the Overlord's tactics. They were predictable in their arrogance. They would attack head-on, believing their overwhelming firepower would crush any resistance. But humanity had learned to fight smarter, not harder, and they had a weapon the Overlords couldn't anticipate: creativity. The battle erupted in an instant. The Overlords fired their first salvo. Before they even had a chance to react, the Excalibur was already darting to the side, its engines roaring. As it executed a series of precise maneuvers, the Overlord shots missed wide, and Klein immediately ordered a counterstrike. "Hit them now," she commanded. The Excalibur unleashed its energy cannons, sending blast after blast into the approaching Overlord fleet. One ship was hit directly and exploded in a blinding flash of light. The others faltered for a moment, their fleet's formation thrown into chaos. But the Overlords quickly recovered, their disciplined forces regrouping, but it was already too late. Klein grinned as she watched the chaos unfold on her monitors. The humans weren't just surviving the first wave, they were turning it into their advantage. "Prepare the next set of torpedoes," she said as she analyzed the Overlord's movements. They had regrouped, but their formation was now scattered, each ship moving at slightly different angles, no longer a unified front. "Lock onto their lead ship," she ordered. "Fire everything we've got." The torpedoes hit with surgical precision, tearing through the lead Overlord ship's hull with ease. It veered off course and collided with another ship in the fleet, creating a catastrophic chain reaction that engulfed several other Overlord vessels in an explosion that rocked the very fabric of space. "We've got them on the ropes," Klein muttered as she surveyed the battlefield. The Overlord fleet was in disarray, their once imposing strength now broken and fragmented, but the battle wasn't over yet. The Overlords retaliated fiercely, launching a series of counterattacks designed to overwhelm the Excalibur, but Klein was already one step ahead. "Brace for impact," she warned the crew as the ship shook from the force of several direct hits, but the Excalibur had been built to withstand punishment. Its reinforced armor held strong as the crew continued their work. Klein surveyed the battlefield once more. The Overlords were retreating, no longer the confident invaders they once were. They were now a broken and disoriented force, struggling to regroup under fire from humanity's relentless assault. But Klein knew better than to assume victory. The Overlords would not give up easily. They would learn from this defeat and come back stronger next time. "Report," she ordered as she turned to her tactical officer. "We've taken minimal damage," the officer replied. "They're pulling back, but we've crippled their flagship and several other ships. Their fleet is in disarray, but they're still a threat." Klein nodded and made her decision. "We don't let them regroup," she said firmly. "We pursue them now. Finish what we started." As the Excalibur pursued the retreating Overlord ships, a sense of excitement filled the crew's hearts. They had proven themselves capable of standing against the might of the Overlords, and now the galaxy would know that humanity was not to be underestimated. But the war was far from over. The Overlords were formidable, and they would return stronger and more determined than ever. The first victory had been earned, but it had only set the stage for an even larger and more intense conflict yet to come. The initial victory had sent shockwaves through the galaxy, but the Overlords were not so easily defeated. The damage to their fleet was extensive, but their pride was far more wounded. Empress Erix Vor, in her lavish throne room, seethed with frustration. The human Dreadnought had crippled their most advanced fleet and humiliated them in front of the galaxy. She was not one to tolerate failure, and she vowed to make humanity pay for daring to challenge the Overlord Empire. "Prepare the Star Destroyer," she ordered, her voice cutting through the room like ice. Her generals and advisors stood in rigid attention, understanding the gravity of her words. The Star Destroyer was the most devastating weapon in the Overlord's arsenal, capable of obliterating entire fleets in a single strike. If humanity thought they had seen the full power of the Overlords, they were sorely mistaken. The Star Destroyer, a colossal weapon the size of a small moon, was an ancient relic of Overlord engineering, an artifact of war older than most galactic civilizations. Its power was legendary, its weapons capable of annihilating any force that dared face it. The Overlords had kept it in reserve for centuries, knowing it was the ultimate deterrent, but now they would unleash it to prove their dominance once and for all. On the Excalibur, Commander Klein was already preparing for the next phase of the battle. Her crew was restless, having tasted the thrill of their first victory, but they knew it was only a matter of time before the Overlords retaliated with something more catastrophic. The reports came in fast and clear. A massive Overlord fleet was on the move, led by a vessel unlike anything they had seen before. The Excalibur was ready, but this time the stakes were much higher. "They're coming for us," Klein said quietly, standing at the bridge's center, scanning the tactical readouts. The Overlord fleet, now including the Star Destroyer, was approaching with frightening speed. The humans had no illusion about their power. This wasn't a fleet to outmaneuver or outgun. This was a battle for survival. The crew worked quickly, recalibrating the ship's weapons and shields, reinforcing every possible defense. But there was no hiding from the Star Destroyer. Its weapon could vaporize their ship in a single blast. They had to fight smart, not hard. "We have one shot at this," Klein said, her voice steely. "We're going to need to use everything we've got and outthink them. It's not about strength. It's about precision and timing. We can't let them get the first strike." As the Excalibur and the Overlord fleet drew closer, tensions ran high. The crew was silent, each one lost in their thoughts, knowing what was at stake. They weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for every species that had been crushed under the Overlord's rule for centuries. The crew knew what their mission was. This battle could change the course of the galaxy. The Star Destroyer loomed large on the horizon, its imposing form casting a shadow across the battlefield. The rest of the Overlord fleet spread out around it, a wall of destruction waiting to fall upon the human ship. Klein knew the key to victory was the element of surprise. The Overlords would expect the humans to engage directly, to try and match their firepower. But that was exactly what they wanted. Evasive maneuvers, Klein ordered, her fingers tapping a rapid sequence on the console. The Excalibur darted to the left just as the first wave of Overlord fire came crashing down. The ship was smaller, faster, and more agile than anything the Overlords had ever faced. The human Dreadnought danced through the barrage of energy blasts, each shot missing by mere inches. "We have a window," Klein said, her voice sharper now, filled with purpose. "Get ready to fire on my mark." The Excalibur surged forward, closing the distance between them and the Star Destroyer. Klein had one shot at this, one moment to strike. The Overlords were confident, assuming their enemy was too small to be a real threat. They underestimated the one thing they could never understand, the human mind. In that moment, as the Overlord fleet concentrated their fire on the smaller Excalibur, Commander Klein executed the unthinkable. She cut power to the Excalibur's engines, causing the ship to drop out of hyperspace unexpectedly, into a direct collision course with the Star Destroyer. For a moment, the Overlords believed they had won. But then, now, Klein screamed. The Excalibur suddenly erupted in a dazzling array of energy blasts from its hidden weapons, all aimed at the Star Destroyer's weak points, the exhaust ports and energy conduits that even the Overlords had forgotten to shield properly. The first blast hit, followed by another, and then another, each one destabilizing the massive ship. The Star Destroyer rocked violently, its shields flickering in response to the unexpected assault. The Overlord's pride had once again betrayed them. They had underestimated humanity, and now they would feel the consequences. As the Overlord's flagship began to falter, Commander Klein knew the battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, they had a real chance to win. The tide was turning, and the Overlords were learning that humanity was not a force to be ignored. The Star Destroyer, crippled by the relentless barrage from the Excalibur, began to break apart, its hull splintering in massive chunks as fireballs and explosions ripped through its core. The Overlords had never faced such a direct challenge before, and now their most powerful weapon was reduced to a dying wreck. But Commander Klein didn't allow herself to feel triumphant. There was still much to do, and the Overlords weren't the type to give up easily. On the bridge of the Excalibur, Klein's eyes never left the screen as she watched the Overlord fleet scramble to regroup, but there was no mistaking the signs of panic in their movements. The loss of the Star Destroyer had thrown them into disarray, and for the first time since humanity had entered the fray, the Overlords were on the back foot. Yet, Klein knew the Overlords would regroup. They always did, and if humanity didn't press the advantage now, the opportunity would slip away. "We need to strike before they recovered," she said, her voice calm, but filled with urgency. "Prepare to disable their retreat ships. We can't let them escape." Her crew moved swiftly, each member falling into their tasks without hesitation. The Excalibur was already on the move, charging toward the remnants of the Overlord fleet. The Overlords, realizing their flagship was doomed, began to break formation, attempting to flee before they were finished off. Klein's orders were clear. They couldn't let them get away, not when the tide had finally turned in their favor. Meanwhile, in the depths of the Overlord command ship, Empress Erix seethed with rage. The loss of the Star Destroyer was a blow to her pride, but it was more than that. She had underestimated the humans, and now they were paying for it. But her fury was tempered with cold resolve. If the humans thought this was over, they were sorely mistaken. The overlords had been pushed to the edge before, and each time they had emerged victorious. This would be no different. "We will not be defeated by these inferior creatures," Erixvor hissed to her closest advisors. "Prepare the secondary fleet. It's time to crush them once and for all." The secondary fleet, an even more formidable force, was already on its way. Smaller than the main fleet, but far more dangerous, the ships were equipped with faster engines, stealth technologies, and weaponry designed to ambush and overwhelm any enemy. The overlords knew their enemies had a weakness: their inability to fight on multiple fronts. They would use this to their advantage. As the Excalibur closed in on the retreating ships, Commander Klein knew the overlords weren't done. She could feel it in her bones. They would be back, and with a vengeance. Her crew prepared to finish the job, launching torpedoes and targeting the remaining overlord vessels. "Keep the pressure on," Klein said, her focus never wavering. "We don't give them a chance to breathe." The Excalibur unleashed a volley of deadly torpedoes, each one finding its mark and tearing through the retreating ships with precision. The overlord fleet was faltering, their ships barely able to maintain formation as the human dreadnought ruthlessly pursued them. But just as it seemed victory was within reach, a new threat emerged from the depths of the overlord fleet. A stealth ship, barely visible on any sensor, darted toward the Excalibur. It was a specialized attack ship, equipped with a quantum disruptor that could cripple any shield system in its path. The humans hadn't even noticed it until it was too late. "Incoming," the tactical officer shouted, his voice trained. "We've got an unregistered vessel heading straight for us." Klein's heart skipped a beat, but she quickly regained her composure. The Excalibur wasn't helpless. The ship's shields flared to life, but the quantum disruptor hit with a violent shockwave, rattling the ship to its core. Lights flickered, alarms blared, and the crew was thrown into chaos. "Damage report," Klein barked, struggling to maintain control as the Excalibur rocked violently from the hit. "We're not out of the woods yet, Commander," the engineer responded. "Shields are down to 30%, and our propulsion system is offline. We've got a few minutes before we're sitting ducks." Klein's mind raced. The overlords were pulling out every trick they had left, and they were desperate. This battle wasn't won yet. It was far from over. But one thing was certain: the Excalibur wasn't going to go down without a fight. "All hands, brace for impact," she ordered. "We're going to give them everything we've got." With their shields down and engines failing, Klein knew it was time to make a move that could turn the battle in their favor. They had the advantage, but only for a fleeting moment. The Excalibur would need to outwit the overlords once again to survive the coming storm. The Excalibur shook violently again as another salvo from the overlord's stealth ship impacted its weakened hull. Sparks flew from the control panels, and the lights on the bridge flickered as the crew scrambled to stabilize their positions. Klein gritted her teeth, hands firmly gripped on the command console, as she fought to keep the ship operational. The odds had just shifted dramatically in the overlord's favor, and yet she refused to give in. The humans were used to being the underdog. They would find a way to survive. "Status report," Klein barked, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. "We've lost power to the rear thrusters," the engineering officer reported urgently, eyes glued to her screen. "Hull integrity is at 45%, and shields are down to 15%. We're vulnerable, Commander." "Not for long," Klein muttered under her breath. "What's the status of the disruptor ship?" "Still maintaining course for us. They're keeping their distance, but they're closing in fast. They know we're crippled." The tactical officer's voice was tight with concern. Klein's mind raced. They had no functional propulsion to escape the incoming threat, and the Excalibur was sitting dead in space like a sitting duck. If they didn't act fast, the overlords would finish the job. But there had to be something. There had to be a way out of this. Suddenly, An idea sparked in her mind. It was risky, unprecedented even, but it was their only shot. Activate emergency reverse thrusters, Klein ordered, a plan forming rapidly. The engineering officer looked at her like she was crazy, but after a brief hesitation, she nodded and started working the controls. "You sure about this, Commander?" the officer asked. "Do it," Klein replied sharply, focusing on the view ahead, watching the stealth ship close in, its weapon systems charging for another strike. The Excalibur's rear thrusters fired with a sudden burst of energy, sending the ship jerking backward with unrestrained force. The quick jolt caused the crew to brace themselves, but it was enough to throw off the trajectory of the stealth ship's next attack. The Overlord ship fired a moment too soon, its weapon slamming harmlessly into the void where the Excalibur had been seconds earlier. "Now, brace for impact," Klein shouted as she seized the opportunity. In a rapid, almost impossible series of maneuvers, the Excalibur turned its damaged, vulnerable rear toward the enemy vessel. With the propulsion reactivated, the ship spun around, moving in an unpredictable direction that caught the stealth ship off guard. It couldn't react fast enough to adjust its trajectory, and Klein immediately opened fire. The Excalibur's remaining weapons, though weakened, unleashed a violent barrage of plasma and energy blasts. The first shot hit the stealth ship's hull, followed by another, then another. Each one found a weak point in the enemy's armor. The stealth ship tried to retreat, but it was too late. Without proper shields, it couldn't evade the relentless barrage. As the Excalibur pressed on, a series of explosions lit up the dark expanse of space. The stealth ship's exterior fractured in multiple places, and within seconds, it was no more than debris scattering through the void. Klein exhaled sharply, feeling a momentary sense of relief. One enemy down. But the battle was far from over. The Excalibur had survived this round, but the Overlord forces were still formidable, and they were far from finished. The rest of the fleet was regrouping, and the Star Destroyer, though crippled, was still a threat. Klein knew they would have to think fast to maintain the initiative. "Pull us back into evasive formation," Klein ordered. "We've taken out the disruptor ship, but we can't afford to stay stationary. The Overlords will be on us again the moment they regroup." Her crew scrambled to reposition the ship, using every scrap of remaining power to keep the Excalibur in motion, even as its systems groaned from the strain. But it wasn't just about surviving. It was about finding a way to win. "We need to take down their command ship next," Klein said, her eyes narrowing as she examined the enemy fleet's movements. The Overlords were gathering their forces for one final push, determined to crush the human resistance. "We need a strategy that hits them where they least expect it," she continued, voice calm but with fire burning in her words. "Target their command ship. If we take that down, the rest of the fleet will fall apart." Her crew looked at her in awe. Despite everything, despite the odds, despite the damage, they were still moving forward, still looking for a way to end this. "Ready when you are, Commander," the tactical officer said, determination in his voice. Klein nodded. They had one shot left, and she would make sure they didn't miss. The fate of humanity and the galaxy hung in the balance. "This isn't over," Klein said, her voice filled with conviction. "Not by a long shot." The Excalibur glided through the empty space, its damaged hull groaning as it maneuvered into position for the next phase of the battle. Klein's eyes were locked on the enemy fleet, calculating their every move. The Overlords had regrouped, their ships now forming a tight formation around the crippled Star Destroyer. But they were vulnerable. They knew it, and Klein knew it too. "This is it," Klein muttered, her fingers running over the controls. "We take their command ship. We take their will to fight." Her crew was focused, no longer daunted by the chaos that had unfolded in the past hours. There was a quiet determination in the air, a belief that they could do this. The Excalibur had been through hell, and now it was time to push back. "We're close," Klein said, turning to her tactical officer. "Target their command ship. All weapons, lock on." The Excalibur's remaining guns powered up, the ship's pulse lasers charging in preparation for the strike. The tactical officer's fingers flew over the console, selecting the weak points in the Overlord command ship's defenses. Its shields were still intact, but with the Excalibur's calculated firepower, it wouldn't stay that way for long. Firing sequence locked. The officer said, voice steady. On your mark, Commander. Klein's gaze never left the view ahead. The Overlord command ship, still under the protection of the remaining fleet, was the key to this entire conflict. If they could cripple it, the Overlords would scatter, their command structure fractured, and their remaining forces would crumble. The distance between the two ships closed quickly. Klein's heart pounded in her chest, but her expression remained cool. She knew the importance of this strike. The fate of the entire mission rested on this one shot. They couldn't afford to miss. Now, Klein shouted. The Excalibur unleashed a deadly barrage of energy blasts, all aimed directly at the heart of the Overlord command ship. The first hit was a direct strike to its shield generators, causing a massive flare of energy that lit up the darkness of space. The shield flickered under the strain, but it held. Barely. But Klein knew it wouldn't last. Concentrate fire on their engines, Klein ordered, watching as the enemy ship reeled from the initial blast. We can't let them escape. With a new targeting solution, the Excalibur's weapons realigned, and a second volley shot out, hitting the Overlord ship's propulsion systems. The energy blasts tore into the engine section, causing a massive explosion that sent debris tumbling into space. The Overlord command ship staggered, its trajectory wobbling. The ship's once imposing silhouette began to lose its imposing shape, becoming increasingly unstable. We've crippled their engines, the tactical officer reported, a note of triumph in his voice. They're not going anywhere. But Klein knew better than to assume victory. She could see the Overlords scrambling, using every bit of their remaining firepower to defend their command vessel. They weren't giving up. Not yet. The Overlord fleet, realizing that their command ship was on the verge of destruction, began to converge. The remaining ships, desperate to protect their dying leader, formed a protective wall around the command ship, shields flaring as they tried to block the incoming fire. They would sacrifice themselves to save their flagship, an Overlord trait that had been ingrained in their culture for centuries. Not enough, Klein muttered, tapping her comms. All hands, prepare for evasive maneuvers. We're not letting them take us down. The Excalibur swerved violently, dodging the incoming fire as it continued to push forward. The remaining Overlord ships launched their own offensive, but Klein's crew had learned from their previous encounters. They moved with fluid precision, responding to each shift in the enemy's fire. The battle was now a brutal dance, humanity's smaller, faster ship darting around the massive, cumbersome Overlord vessels, striking hard and fast while avoiding their retaliatory fire. Now's our chance, Klein said through gritted teeth. She knew their window was closing, but the Overlord's defenses were weakening. If they could land one final blow, they could end this. With a fierce battle cry, Klein gave the order. All guns, fire at will. The Excalibur's remaining energy was channeled into its weapons, and once again, a flurry of energy blasts slammed into the Overlord command ship's vulnerable points. The shields began to buckle, and the ship's engines flickered, unable to regain power. It was clear now. The Overlord fleet was on the verge of collapse. Klein knew the Overlords would not surrender. But this was their moment, their one opportunity to break the chains of galactic oppression. Humanity had proven its strength, and now it was time to show the universe that they would never again bow to the Overlord's tyranny. The endgame was near. The final strike was coming. And Commander Klein wouldn't stop until it was over. The Excalibur's guns erupted one last time, and this time, there was no mistaking the outcome. A brilliant explosion flared from the Overlord command ship, its once imposing form crumbling under the sustained barrage. The Overlord's pride and final line of defense were shattered, and in the wake of the explosion, the remaining fleet began to unravel, their cohesion lost. Panic spread like wildfire through their ranks. Without leadership, without their flagship, they were nothing more than a scattered collection of ships desperate to escape. On the Excalibur's bridge, Commander Klein watched the Overlord fleet fall into disarray. The massive, monolithic ships, once filled with confident, overpowering might, were now retreating in every direction. Some already fleeing back into hyperspace, others desperately trying to fight back in a last-ditch effort to protect themselves. But their will to fight was broken. They're retreating. The tactical officer reported, his voice filled with disbelief. They're scattering. Their command ship is down. It's over. Klein's heart raced as she surveyed the battlefield, her mind still calculating the next moves. It wasn't over. Not yet. There were still pockets of resistance to mop up, and the Overlords were never to be underestimated. Even in their defeat, they were dangerous. "Prepare pursuit units," Klein ordered, her voice calm, yet brimming with authority. "We can't let them regroup. Finish the job." Her crew nodded, moving with practiced speed as the Excalibur adjusted course, aiming toward the remaining Overlord ships. They wouldn't allow the enemy to live to fight another day. Humanity had won this battle, but Klein knew the war was far from over. The Overlords would regroup, learn from their defeat, and return stronger. But today, the tide had turned in favor of the human race. As the Excalibur began to move toward the remaining enemy vessels, a new signal came through. A transmission, weak and garbled, but unmistakable. It was from the Overlord's flagship, now nothing but drifting debris. Klein's fingers hovered over the comms panel as she listened carefully to the transmission's message. "Humanity, you have won. But understand this. We are not the galaxy's greatest threat. You have awoken something far worse, something that is coming. We will return, and when we do, you will wish you had never challenged us." Klein's face hardened. It wasn't the warning that shook her, it was the unmistakable weight of truth in the voice that delivered it. The Overlords had been many things, ruthless, oppressive, and domineering. But their words carried a chilling promise. Something else was coming. Something worse. The silence on the bridge was deafening. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Klein looked at her crew, their eyes filled with the same sense of resolve and unease. Humanity had won a great victory today, but they were not yet done fighting. The galaxy was a far more dangerous place than they had ever realized. "We will be ready," Klein said quietly, her voice a solemn vow to her crew. "We'll make sure they never threaten us again. Whatever this new enemy is, we'll face them together." As the Excalibur pulled away from the wreckage of the Overlord fleet, humanity's first real victory in this galactic war was set in history. But the warning rang in Klein's mind. No matter how strong they had become, no matter how hard they had fought, the real battle was just beginning. The galaxy had seen the power of humanity, but soon it would learn what they were truly capable of when pushed to the brink. The future was uncertain, and darkness loomed on the horizon. But Commander Klein and the crew of the Excalibur had proven one undeniable truth. Humanity was no longer just surviving. They were rising, and they would never back down again.